For the video today, I wanted to take a look at a couple of scenes from the movie The Dark Knight, which was released back in 2008, and I wanted to analyze these scenes from a libertarian perspective. Now, before I begin, I want to put a disclaimer here and say that I am not an authority on libertarianism, so if you think I misunderstood a certain libertarian principle and you want to set me straight, go ahead and let me know in the comments section below. So the first scene from The Dark Knight that I wanted to look at is the scene where Dr. Crane, the Scarecrow, meets with the mob to discuss dealing drugs. In this scene, a bunch of mobsters in black SUVs drive up, and Dr. Crane and his henchmen come out of a van, and the mobsters pull out a raving person who is hallucinating, and the mob says, "Look what your drugs did to my customers!" And then Dr. Crane says, "Buyer beware. I told you my drug would take you places. I never said they would take you places you wanted to go." So as Dr. Crane and the mob are discussing the side effects of the drugs, a group of Batman copycat vigilantes try to stop them from trafficking in drugs, and then Batman comes to stop both drug dealers and the other vigilantes. Let's start off by saying that in a libertarian world, Dr. Crane would be able to sell whatever drugs he wanted, and the public would be able to consume whatever drugs he provided. Now, this isn't to say that narcotics are good or that we should be encouraging their use, but rather we should not give the government the power to use the threat of coercion and violence to prevent people from using their private property as they see fit. Libertarians believe that actions are only criminal if they invade someone's private property, whether it's the private property of their own body or the private property of their material possessions. So Dr. Crane and these mobsters would be free to deal whatever they want, and the public would be free to consume whatever they want because this is them exercising their private property rights. The economist Murray Rothbard explains on page 50 of his book For a New Liberty, The Libertarian Manifesto, that to the libertarian, crime is an act of aggression against a man's property right, either in his own person or his materially owned objects. Crime is an invasion by the use of violence against a man's property and therefore against his liberty. Since we have established that dealing and consuming drugs would be legal in a libertarian world, we must accept that the actions of Batman and his copycat vigilantes are criminal because they are invading a person's private property rights by assaulting them physically to prevent them from, engaging in a mutually beneficial, voluntary economic transaction. It's also interesting to note that in this scene, Dr. Crane tells the mob that he is the only drug dealer still in business, but it turns out that his drugs are much more dangerous than your average street drugs. So making the drugs illegal has in effect made drugs more dangerous. This is actually perfectly in line with the economist Milton Friedman's criticisms of the war on drugs. In the Liberty Pen YouTube video, Milton Friedman, Why Drugs Should Be Legalized, Milton Friedman makes the argument that the criminalization of drugs has led to an increase in more potent and dangerous drugs because people who are fearful of being arrested naturally want to engage in fewer drug transactions to avoid getting caught. And they will want to get more potent drugs to compensate for the lower supply of drugs and the greater risk of purchasing them. So yeah, it just interests me that this principle is illustrated, probably unintentionally, in this film. Now, all of this doesn't mean that Dr. Crane gets a get-out-of-jail-free card, because you could make a good argument that Dr. Crane should be prosecuted for committing fraud because he sold a product to a customer while lying about the product's side effects. And, fraud is against libertarian principles. They believe that's a violation of private property rights because you exchanged goods and services under false pretenses. Now, a major theme in the movies Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, police corruption is a very big theme. In a few scenes in The Dark Knight, we have Harvey Dent telling Commissioner Gordon that he doesn't trust his police officers because he previously investigated them for corruption. And it turns out that at least 2 police officers were bought off by the mob to kidnap Harvey and Rachel, which led to Rachel getting blown up and Harvey getting his face melted off. So it seems that Gotham's criminals have a financial incentive to buy exemptions for their illegal activities from the corrupt cops in the Gotham PD. Now, Murray Rothbard argues that much of the police corruption that we see depicted in movies like The Dark Knight can be solved by making all voluntary economic transactions, including drugs, gambling, prostitution, etc., legal. He states on pages 138 and 139 of his book For a New Liberty that, quote, police corruption occurs in those areas where entrepreneurs supply voluntary services to consumers, but where the government has decreed that these services are illegal. Where gambling, for example, is outlawed, the law places into the hands of the police assigned to the gambling detail the power to sell the privilege of engaging in the gambling business. The way, then, to eliminate police corruption is simple but effective. Abolish the laws against voluntary business activity and against all victimless crimes. And of course, libertarians define victimless crimes as those activities which do not impede on the private property rights of individuals. In other words, when the government makes a certain voluntary economic transaction illegal, corrupt cops have the authority to sell special privileges to the highest bidders like Falcone, Maroni, and the Joker. Now, the most controversial scene in The Dark Knight is the ending, where Batman has created a device to turn all private cell phones in Gotham into mini sonar devices so he can see anywhere in Gotham City and listen to anyone's voice. Now, Batman makes the case that Joker is such a huge threat that we need to set aside our liberties temporarily, just long enough to stop a criminal for the greater good. This is an obvious no-no for libertarians. It may sound silly, but if Batman wanted to create such a device, he would have to get the people of Gotham to agree to participate in it voluntarily. I'm just imagining Batman going door to door, knocking on doors and saying, "Would you like to participate in our in our surveillance program?" As inefficient as that seems, that is the only moral way for better, similar voluntary methods are the only moral way for Batman to justify turning Gotham City cell phones into sonar devices and listening on people's conversations. Now, some make the argument that isn't a strong central government necessary to stop threats like the Joker or the organized mob? My question in response to that is, would Batman's villains like the Joker or mob bosses like Falcone and Maroni have as much power as they did if they didn't have the ability to influence an overreaching government? I mean, how much power would the Joker have over Gotham if he couldn't buy off cops to look the other way while he hatched his schemes? It's just something to ponder. So this is going to be a brief video. I won't go over every single libertarian objection in the entire film, so if there were scenes in the film that you thought violated libertarian principles, or if you want to argue why my interpretation is garbage, make your case in the comments below, and I will catch you next time.